It's ruining the topsoil, and it's killing the living organism that is the soil. Because, I mean, dirt is just crushed rock, sand, dead organic matter. But soil includes the bacteria and the fungi living that produce the nutrients for plants. And when you monocrop, when you pull the same nutrients from the soil constantly, this leads to massive crop shortages that people don't really foresee. Companies don't really foresee it.
Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum. In the media, overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output, but very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time: cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the grand solar minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David Dubine.
And I say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on this planet. Today, I have an exciting episode lined up for us. As I talked about media censorship in the last program, about how voices are trying to silence alternative opinions, explanations of what's happening with our atmosphere, what's happening with our food pricing, and what's happening with our politics. I have with me tonight Ben Shields from The Right Media. He runs the YouTube channel Right Media. He also has a Facebook page, The Right Media, up on BitChute as well. This is an important thing for freedom of moving in case we become censored on YouTube, BitChute. So The Right Media on BitChute. I also have a presence on BitChute. I've been reloading my entire channel there. That's the Adapt 2030 BitChute channel. And then Ben Politics on Twitter. You can find that BENS, Ben's Politics. Now, Ben, since we talked a few times ago, we are focused on the distraction in the media, and I'm just going to let you go with it because I know our time's limited tonight. So, Ben, I appreciate you coming on, and welcome to the show. It is your floor. I'm interested in what we had a little pre-conversation just for a minute or two before the show, and we threw some ideas across. So, Ben, tell us about your trip, grains, and everything else.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Dave. I really appreciate it. There's also a fairly respected petroleum geologist and oil analyst named Art Berman. And he's talking about how crude oil supplies will soon move back into a surplus. And there's a reason that Trump wants to up the oil production, which has increased substantially since Trump took office. But the U.S. stores the second most barrels of oil in the world. You know who stores the most? China. I'll elaborate on China a little bit more later, but this is a push as we enter a period of increasing food prices, which is happening. I'm looking at a graph right now out of The Economist showing how food prices have been rising since around 2000, 2001. And granted, they fluctuate a lot, but determining the high point of food prices is generally pretty difficult because it's a multi-factor system. It's pretty complex. But on top of that, the average food prices are the highest that they've been since the global food price crisis in 07, 08. I mean, the price of wheat in Australia is at a 10-year high due to horrible growing conditions, and they have an estimated 38% loss of wheat production in the middle and eastern territories. And then you come over to the U.S. In the U.S., there are 4 huge wheat-producing states that have seen a decline in the last few years. That would be Texas, Minnesota, Montana, and North Dakota. And this is largely because of frost early on in the growing season after the wheat has started to sprout. Seeing that more growing areas are going offline, we do have to keep in mind that the graph of how much food can be grown on a certain amount of acreage is constantly growing. Technology is constantly getting better. I mean, humans are are innovators. They're not just, mouths to feed. They're also minds that can innovate. And there are some easily identifiable problems with the farm industry. I mean, don't get me wrong. One that I would certainly point out is farm subsidies. I mean, this is driving farmers to grow corn for ethanol, even though they're paying the farmers more than it's worth to the market. And that's just to make it worth it for the farmer's time. Basically, there's a huge amount of loss. And it's the kind of cycle or the system that if it's iterated through enough times, it will result in collapse of the industry. And I mean, if you talk about, the collapse of the ethanol industry, that could even be the economy as a whole, because it'll affect far more than just ethanol. But another aspect to consider is that this land is being used and its resources are being pulled, and it's being pulled for ethanol and it's not being used for food. But if ethanol wasn't subsidized, then it probably would be used for food because it would make the farmers more money. And then another issue with farming like that is that it's ruining the topsoil, and it's killing the living organism that is the soil. Because, I mean, dirt is just crushed rock, sand, dead organic matter. But soil includes the bacteria and the fungi living that produce the nutrients for plants. And when you monocrop, when you pull the same nutrients from the soil constantly, this leads to massive crop shortages that people don't really foresee. Companies don't really foresee it. In fact, the Black Plague in Europe was said to have been preventable with beans. And the reason that people have said that is because people during that time were largely malnourished. And it was because the crop growing was terrible. And what they failed to do was plant legumes, because legumes replace nitrogen in the soil, which is necessary for so many other crops to flourish. But they didn't do that. They had the crop shortages. People had just destroyed immune systems, and then the plague was able to spread like, well, the plague. But that's what happens when these crops are planted in the same place every year. They exhaust the soil. I understand that farms are going for efficiency. I understand the whole industry is trying to be more efficient, and that's why there are farms that produce food that monocrop. But there has to be then some manual replacement of the nutrients to the soil. Otherwise, I mean, everything will die and it'll turn into northern Africa, where they wrecked the topsoil hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. I mean, my main complaint here in all this is how the crop production has been pretty much led off a cliff by subsidies and poor management, but also you can't discount the colder temperatures, specifically above the 45-degree latitude mark, which I experienced quite a bit of my trip. And I can touch on that a little bit more later. But the last point that I want to make is that even though Oregon, Washington, California, Montana, all those states in the West, the Northwest, that are really producing massive amounts of crops, it's not natural. I mean, you can drive for hundreds of miles through dead shrubbery and dead grass, and the only green that you'll really see is usually a perfectly square patch of land with one of those giant watering machines parked in the corner, or in some cases currently watering the field. And the water is brought into the fields. The rainfall in these states would not allow the food production to be near the level it's at without the artificial watering. I mean, just in general, really, aquifers out west are being drained faster than they're being replenished. And I'm not saying it's a crisis situation yet, but it's not sustainable. And collecting rainwater, it's a great alternative. And I think that there are certainly more people looking to go that direction. But doing some research on it, I found something that was kind of interesting. And it's most likely sterile. I mean, I'd imagine it's sterile. But for every raindrop to form, it needs to begin by bonding to a piece of dirt or dust. Like, the chance of a water molecule bonding to another water molecule just on its own is so incredibly small that I think it was estimated it would have only happened like 4 times in the history of the Earth. I mean, it's so small. But if you collect a lot of the rainwater and you run it through a filter system or something, I mean, that could prove to be a short-term solution. But again, that's more for households. It's for personal use. When it comes to watering huge fields, the water's going to run out, and it's not coming from the sky quite enough. I saw this firsthand about a month and a half ago when I was out in that part of the country. And I got plenty of pictures to it, too. I mean, the farms are just, They're largely artificial out there. So I guess that's good for an opening bit.
Yeah, let me toss a side thought in there with you as well. You were talking about the prices of grains haven't run up this much since 2007 and 8. But we have to remember what happened in the Middle East during that time. Food price rises, especially in Egypt, for the prices of wheat were the catalyst for the governmental change. And then we saw that Arab Spring sweep through largely the other countries in the Middle East, all based on food prices as well. So you have to wonder, with this next cycle 2.0 of rising food prices in the Middle East, there will be no dictator to lash out the anger at. So I'm wondering what politically is going to happen, because the food prices are going to rise. That's just a given. So if you're trying to work out a mathematical formula of, you have an A and a B plus C minus D divided by E equals, well, the A is for sure going to be rising food prices, whether you like it or not. And that's the reason I do my channel, is to try to explain why our crops are being lost through 400-year cycles in the sun, and then it's going to push food prices. So, Ben, what do you think about the Middle East coming up? What happens if we get 2.0? But imagine if the food prices double over what they were in 2007 and 8 that caused all the civil unrest. Imagine double or triple prices, what caused the dictatorship regime changes all over the Middle East. But imagine now the price is even higher than that. Where would we go?
Well, actually, I kind of covered that in a video I did a little while ago talking about the anti-human movement. And there's something really interesting about famines around the world that I've started to notice. And I think that when you have food prices rising, government is inevitably going to try to take control of industries and socialize industries, or, hand out massive subsidies, like try to alter the system in some way. And government is the last entity to get involved in any food or energy concerns. They're the last entity you want involved in any of that, because they run it horribly. The most damage has been done to the environment when the government decides to start initiatives and programs to save the earth. They've done the most damage to food when they start handing out these subsidies and then cutting the legs out of other areas of the industries, and they're pretty much just left to flounder. And they're propping up systems of business that can't function. They're not self-sustaining. So it just constantly feeds off the taxpayer. I mean, think of the alternative energies like windmills. Windmills take so much diesel fuel to lug everything to the middle of the country. And let me tell you, I drove through Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, Colorado, Utah, parts of California. I mean, there were times when I'd go hours looking at windmills along the highway, and they're either not moving or they're barely moving. And I found a news article that this was a little while ago. Those companies, the wind energy companies, in 2016, they were subsidized to around the tune of $176 billion. That's a waste of resources and just a needless loss of the best resource we do have, like diesel, and more broadly petrol, because there's also diesel made from biomass. And I guess while I'm on it, quick funny thing about biomass is that if you were to have the same number of people die from nuclear energy as die from biomass pollution every year, you'd have to have a Chernobyl every single day. So when people complain about nuclear energy, they really have no idea what they're complaining about. But my point is, the government drives environmental problems. It drives food issues. I can cover the Federal Reserve too at some point, but a good example of what I'm getting at, I'm not saying that the food crisis in the Middle East is fabricated, but considering all of the factors is something that can be a little bit daunting. And I only say that because I think about like the Irish potato famine, and people think of that as, a time when crops were doing terrible. The potato it wasn't yielding like it should. The Irish people they wouldn't eat anything but potatoes or whatever. But the truth of the matter was, the government was taking the beef and the grains and everything else, all the other food that the Irish were producing, and they were exporting it. And there should have never been a famine. That was something that was largely brought on by the government. And that's just one example. But we talk about food issues in the Middle East, and things are just so corrupt over there. It's like when you look at Mexico and it's like, well, Mexico's run terribly, but I mean, it's a state run by thugs. And that's a lot of what the Middle East is. So they're only out for themselves. They see all of the individual people as just cogs in the state machine, just minions, just resources to be expended. And that's pretty much how I see it, I guess.
Yeah, and then maybe you'll even be more effective if you're allowed to choose your own career and you don't know you're in the prison. If you could choose your own career and what you really want to do, you could earn more tax revenue because you like what you're doing. You're not at the end of a whip being forced to do something you don't want to do. We could take that a million directions, I mean, crazy times. But hey, I had a question about the windmills where you were mentioning the over $170 billion for subsidy. Was that for the actual price on the kilowatt hour that was being subsidized, or was that subsidies for the manufacturer and the install or something? Do you have any breakdown on the numbers of where the actual money went to, into which was it generation or was it actually installation? Do you know about that?
Yeah, I found the article here. It says of the 176 billion provided to the wind energy sector, 2.9 billion came from the local and state governments, 9.4 from federal grants, tax credits. The rest was provided in federal loans or loan guarantees, and it just went to General Electric. It went to the individual company. They had NextEra Energy, General Electric, Mid-American Energy Company. So, yeah, it seems like it just got doled out to the individual energy companies.
Yeah, it got doled out to the companies that had lobbyists to go to Washington. You got to be kidding me. GE. They're one of the largest companies on the planet, yet they're still asking for money to install wind. You mean they didn't make it efficient enough for it to run and generate its own ROI on a payback at some point? How is it that we could still be subsidizing multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations that are really some of the largest on the planet? And they're trying to provide us with stuff that doesn't even work? This is ridiculous. These are the types of things that should be questioned and that you should be asking lawmakers about themselves, because you talk about this indentured servitude that you're in the Middle East, that they're being sold as minions in to keep the government structure going. It's no different here. If anybody's deluding themselves thinking that, we're the best out here and we're just hiding and we're the only ones that do it and we're cool and everybody else is minions and we're not, that's exactly what the powers that be want you to think, so they can keep you trapped in this invisible, barless prison.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about squeezing the breath out of an industry and then having to socialize it, and then now the government's running it. They control healthcare. It's basically trying to take over all the aspects of your life that make it your life.
Yeah, that's crazy. Hey, I wanted to talk about soils for a second. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Hamaker's work. Now, Dr. Hamaker talked the exact same things that you're talking about with the depletion of soils, and he goes into the glaciation cycles, through full-blown glaciation cycles into the interglacial, the interstatal, and then back into the glacial cycle again. And he talks about right after we exit a full-on blown glacial cycle, since there were glaciers, everything has been remineralized, if you will. Granite and other rocks have been crushed into powder and mixed with the soils, so when these glaciers recede, plus the water that's running off, these lands are so fertile. This is some of the most fertile lands you'll ever get to. And then as we go through, 8, 10, 12,000 years, then the topsoils are getting blown off. And Dr. Hamaker's work was also talking about the size of the trees reduces. There's more infestation of insects because plants just aren't as healthy. You alluded to that as well with the human system. But he was talking about remineralizing the soil using granite dust. Really, just that simple. No pesticides, no herbicides, granite dust. Something so simple that can be added right back in the soil that would double and triple yields. Heard from people who were using it. But that's a solution as well when you talk about all these unmineralized or demineralized soils that are across the planet. Just seems like it's the timing of we're kind of at the end of an interglacial anyway, so it fits within that couple thousand years of the end of that, of the middle part between glaciations where the soils get worn down. So where are we going to go? The temperatures are going to drop and the rainfall's not in the same place as it used to be. It's either mega floods over here, like India got 4.5 times of the rain this season than the average for the season. And then other places, total bone dry drought that haven't seen rain in a year. So, this whole agricultural system here, we got the soils, we got the rainfalls, and then they still want to subsidize windmills or something. I don't get it. Maybe we could subsidize let's say, research on indoor vertical farming or something that would save our species here during this squeeze point.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly areas like if you're going to put subsidies somewhere, like if the government just has to put them somewhere, there's certainly better places to put them than these energy forms that just aren't giving any kind of decent ROI. And I think that there's really something to be said about the climate changes over time, because I was looking into this, and if you go back to like the 1000s, the 1100s, it was significantly warmer then than it is now. And I mean, you had there were vineyards going up into northern England and Scotland, and they were growing wheat in Iceland. I mean, they were growing wheat in Iceland. That's insane to think about. The way that things have shifted over just centuries. It's the kind of thing that I don't think people ever really think about when, you see a graph and it's just, the last 100 years, last 150 years. It's like, no, how about you go the last 1,500 years? And people have this very strange, I guess, fear of CO2. Let's just buy the global warming narrative for a second. Okay, let's say that the Earth is warming. That's a good thing because you have to think of the planet like an economy. Okay, so you have banks that take money from people. People store the money in the bank, and then the banks invest that money with the hopes of multiplying that wealth, because wealth, it's not a zero-sum game. I mean, we got out of that jungle mentality a long time ago where if you gain something, it's because someone else had to lose it. And when money is being invested and wealth is being multiplied, it keeps the economy moving, and a stagnant economy is bad. And we have all this carbon, which is part of the Earth's economy, that's trapped in fossil fuels. I'm not advocating for massive fossil fuel use, but I am saying that the alarm bells concerning global warming are only being raised by the people who don't even understand climate change. When CO2 levels rise, there are more plants, and as a result, more animals that come into being. And this means that more of the sun's energy is utilized for life on Earth rather than just soaking into the soil or reflecting back into the atmosphere. And there were also times when the amount of CO2 on Earth was far higher and the Earth was colder than it is now. So CO2 clearly isn't the single factor, but you have environmentalists who make this their key point, and like CO2 is the only thing to worry about. We need the carbon tax. And we should welcome more CO2 in the atmosphere. I mean, we should welcome warmer temperatures. I mean, obviously to a certain degree, and there's no indication. It'll just keep increasing without stopping. But the cold times in the Earth's history are a time of famine and just huge losses of life. I mean, evidence of global warming has been faked in the past. People are paid to find certain results. Look at the Paris Climate Accord. That data was garbage. But people are paid to find these results. They're not just paid to assess what the truth is. They have to justify their own research. So if global warming is true, great. Carbon taxes and mass outcry is not the solution. Removing subsidies is, I think, more along the lines of the answer. And, allowing the energy market to operate freely and just without any regulation other than basic non-aggression principles. If you start putting these legislative strangleholds on the market, it's dangerous because of how important energy is to people. When you start messing with that market, you're putting people's lives at risk by removing back pressure on the market through favorability, subsidies, certain targeted legislation, all of that. And it skews innovation in the energy market because there's not that back pressure. And these innovations can make it more accessible for people and cheaper. And they can discover new energy resources, because something I've recently thought quite a bit about and heard some people speak about is, what are resources? Well, they're natural entities that people have adapted to be useful. So I wish that global warming was true. I don't particularly think it's true beyond question, but the solar cycles need to be examined. I've seen no self-identified environmentalist even hint at the effect that the sun has on our climate. It's a bit concerning to me. I mean, when you see the crop insurance claims in the northern U.S. and, all across Europe and Asia, it's clear that there's something going on that people in the mainstream are not explaining clearly. And when you look at like the Chinese Communist Party's move into agriculturally rich areas, I mean, it's clear they're not expecting to just get these crops back on the mainland of China next year or the year after that, or likely for many years. And with importing so much food, it would be more than worth their time to just take some Chinese Communist Party members, send them to agriculturally rich areas, and then have them send the food back cheap. I mean, Venezuela, which we've talked about before, is two birds with one stone. Or, well, okay, it's really three birds with one stone. I mean, they have oil, they have agricultural land, and they have living space. And the Chinese Communist Party can have oil for basically free from them, thanks to those crack oil for money deals that I've discussed in the past that they've made with the government of Venezuela. I mean, that's why you don't nationalize energy. And they're constantly trying to expand. The Chinese Communist Party is constantly trying to expand. Look at what they're doing in Australia. Like I've talked about that before, and really I could rant about China for a while. But my big point is that global warming isn't what it's cracked up to be. If it was, then it's good. I mean, I wouldn't believe that unequivocally for several reasons, but I'd also like to address some of the anecdotal evidence from when I was recently, like I was saying, above the 45-degree latitude line in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, whatnot, because I saw quite a bit that really solidified a lot of what you've been saying and a lot of what I've been reading about before I actually went on this trip. And what I noticed is if you go into Utah, it's just desert in Utah. There was obviously nothing growing there other than like desert plants. But when you get into Montana, Oregon, Washington, even Northern California, there are plants that were once green that are now dead, like newly dead. And there's clearly something going on. And being able to see the symptoms allows you to just begin to diagnose the disease. And the disease, like some people might think, is not people. Really, actually wouldn't even classify it as a disease. It's a cycle that people have to prepare for and be told about. I mean, people, their lifespan isn't long enough to really get a grasp on some of these huge solar cycles, like the 400-year cycles. So they have to be told about what's going on. And we have the technology to do it. It's just that the mainstream and the government and so many different research agencies aren't doing it. They're just not addressing the root issue. I mean, the sun will do way more to the earth than humans.
Yeah, Ben, could I jump in with a thought there?
Yeah.
So you have to think about it. And the first thing that they've done, this global movement of the mainstream media and paid for academic science that's trying to prove something to get their grant funding, it was to lock us into this. Our entire, I guess, climate of the earth has been reduced down to 50 years or less. Because almost anybody you talk to and you say, well, since the satellite record temperature began, and that's where they've boiled it down to is, they rarely go back over 100 years in any of A, the news articles, B, when they're trying to explain something. They always talk about the era of, after World War II, or mainly since the 1970s when we had satellite record data. But they do not ever want you to go back into those multi-centuries. How about millennia? You talked about the wine vineyards in the UK, et cetera. That was the abundant time. That was an apex of society. These cold times come in and we squeeze and we go into the dark ages and things contract. I mean, everything contracts. Population of the planet, economy, invention, art, literature, it all contracts.